It's Thursday, June 19th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes, and happy Juneteenth. Today on the show, it's a little tricky because we are talking about the fighting between Israel, Iran, and apparently the U.S. And it's tricky because things are happening pretty fast, so I'm hoping that a lot of this hasn't changed entirely by the time you're listening to this. But if it has, I still think it's important to understand how we got to this moment, because it didn't start with just missile strikes last week. But before we get to that, make sure you're following and subscribe to Make It Make Sense with Granthermes on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube if you're watching there. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got a brand new article out about an influx of National Guard troops and service members calling a GI rights hotline right now over what we've been seeing in Los Angeles and what might be heading for more democratically controlled states and cities. But that is just for paid subscribers. So to get access to that, it's just $5 a month. Otherwise, share the show on social media. It really helps this thing out. It's Mims Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. All right, with that out of the way, let's get to today's episode. So, in case you missed it, and before we dive into everything today, I want to get you up to speed, a little bit of context for how we got to where we are and what's happening between Israel and Iran. Now, this stuff goes back thousands of years, but I'm just going to be starting with what happened last week, which was Israel launched what it said was a preemptive set of airstrikes against Iran, citing a new report from the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, which is the global watchdog for all things nuclear. That report said Iran hadn't been holding up its end of the deal with the IAEA when it came to reporting on nuclear energy work, which it was allowed to do, namely saying that since 2019, Iran couldn't give credible explanations for the presence of uranium particles at several undeclared locations in Iran, or give information on the current locations of nuclear material, which is not good, because it's the position of the Iranian government that Israel shouldn't exist, and the U.S. isn't far behind on that list, followed by a lot of Western European nations. So for Iran to have missing nuclear material is genuinely bad. But it is also worth saying here that the head of the IAEA, a guy named Rafael Mariano Grossi, has been adamant over the last week that while Iran has not been compliant in those areas, they did not find any evidence that Iran was making a nuclear weapon. Here he is just this morning saying it on Al Jazeera.
For that. So, and at the same time, we said very clearly in that report that preceded these dramatic events and the attack, that we did not find in Iran elements to indicate that there is an active, systematic plan to build a nuclear weapon. So
that is as clear as it gets from a group of people who are as serious as they come. But nevertheless, Israel, which does have nuclear weapons, read that report and saw it as a reason to launch these strikes on Iran, specifically targeting cities like the Iranian capital of Tehran and targeting nuclear enrichment sites, which has led to worries that there could be radiation leaks from those places. Now, Iran has responded in kind, sending rockets and missiles into Israel and into cities and populated areas, and just today struck a hospital in southern Israel. And this kind of conflict is as tense as it gets in global politics. Both sides see the other as an existential threat, which is rooted for them in religion. Israelis are majority Jewish, obviously, and Iranians are majority Muslim, meaning the conflict here has some pretty immovable foundations. Nuclear power is on the table, whether it's Israelis' nuclear bombs or Iran's nuclear energy program, and what happens in these countries could start a domino effect because Iran has close ties to Russia and the U.S. is Israel's closest ally, meaning if one country decides to escalate things further, other countries might have to step in and things could spill over into other fighting in other parts of the world from there. And I will say that is a worst-case scenario, and we are a long way off from that, but those are the kinds of worries that people have. And we might not be as far off as we'd like, because for the last week, President Donald Trump has been wildly unpredictable when it comes to where the U.S. stands and what his plans are to avoid a war. When he was asked on Wednesday if the U.S. would engage in airstrikes in Iran, he told reporters, "You don't know that I'm even going to do it. You know I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do." Which, with the potential for nuclear war on the table here, playing it coy is really scary. And for days on social media, Trump has been suggesting that he's known about Israeli strikes ahead of time, including one where he told people to evacuate Tehran. But his tone about these things made it seem like Israel is somehow getting U.S. permission or a blessing of some kind to carry out these strikes, mostly using U.S.-made weapons and planes, which puts the U.S. closer to being directly involved in this war. And then, just 2 days ago, Trump seemed to put the U.S. directly involved in the fighting by posting online, after a series of airstrikes on Iran, quote, "We now have complete and total control of the skies over Iran. Iran had good sky trackers and other defensive equipment, and plenty of it, but it doesn't compare to American-made, conceived, and manufactured stuff," which he put in quotation marks for some reason. "Nobody does it better than the good old USA." Now, that's some unsettling language there, because the vast majority of Americans, according to a new poll from The Economist and YouGov polling, we don't want to go to war with Iran. 60% of American adults said no. 61% of Democrats and 53% of Republicans all said no to war. But Trump saying "we" at the beginning of that post means us, the U.S., and it puts us already directly involved in this conflict. And CBS News is also now reporting that on Tuesday night, Trump approved U.S. airstrikes on Iran, specifically targeting a secretive uranium enrichment site 125 miles south of Tehran called Fordo. It's not really important that you know exactly where this place is or what it looks like, but you're going to hear the name a lot in the next couple weeks. And Trump has been in high-level situation room meetings with all sorts of cabinet and intelligence and military people, and that's where he gave the go-ahead. But the timeline and how exactly these things would work is still being discussed, largely because of a few reasons. First, the broader intelligence community, so the people working and with working knowledge on the ground in Iran, are saying that the country isn't close to building a nuclear bomb and hasn't even started working on a way to deliver that bomb, even if they were working on one. But the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, who was a political appointee, not a lifelong intelligence community member, and has had a long history while he was in Congress of voting for the president's ability to make war against Iran, has been saying the opposite of what his agency and other agencies have been telling Trump, saying that Iran is close to having a nuclear weapon, which, like I said, just isn't what we think is happening right now. Second, striking Fordo is really hard. It's carved into the side of a mountain, it's underground, and it takes a special 30,000-pound bomb to get at something like that. And right now, the Israelis don't have the capability of doing that. They don't have a plane big enough to carry something like that. But also, experts around Trump have reportedly said that it might not even be enough. That bomb is called a bunker buster, and it might not be enough to completely wipe out this nuclear site. And they think that what would actually do it is known as a tactical nuclear strike, so a smaller nuclear bomb of our own. Now, that's the most extreme scenario, and so far Trump reportedly has shown no interest in doing that, but it is something that's been brought up. Now, third, and thankfully in the opposite direction, there are negotiations set to happen between Iran and European leaders, where those negotiators are hoping to ease tensions back from this brink of nuclear disaster we seem to be looking at. But those have yet to take place. And the thing is, a lot of this conflict was likely avoidable, and it can be traced back to Trump's first administration, because in 2018, you might remember Trump pulled out of a deal that President Barack Obama negotiated with Iran, European world leaders, and the IAEA in 2015 that allowed Iran to develop nuclear energy while under strict supervision from the rest of the world so they wouldn't build a bomb. It was hailed at the time as a major step forward in diplomacy for the Middle East, for Iran, that had the long-term potential to bring Iran closer to the West, a lot like it was in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, and away from superpowers like Russia and China. But Trump blew up that deal during his first term, largely because it was a win for Obama that he was trying to undo, which was kind of his whole thing, especially during the first few years of his first presidency. He just was trying to undo the Obama legacy, and this was part of it, but the consequences of this were dire. The Institute for Science and International Security, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization, found that before the Obama-era deal, Iran had about 1,000 or so centrifuges at its nuclear sites, which are used to enrich uranium to then use in a bomb. That number dropped to 0 during the deal, meaning it was working. And then when Trump pulled out, the number starting in about 2019 shot through the roof to more than 15,000 of those enriching tools in the early 2020s, with plans for that to go higher. And it's really worth saying here that if you remember, the whole reason Israel said it was going to launch these strikes against Iran was because the IAEA report said that since 2019, Iran had not been honest about its nuclear energy program. That tracks back to right after Trump blew up this original deal. Now, some of this is on the Biden administration too. I'm not going to leave that out. That administration knew this thing was on the table, knew that they needed to get Iran back into these negotiations, and couldn't pull together a deal with Iran or even get them to come back to the table post-pandemic. And Biden himself said the deal was dead. And it's really seen as this unforced error for the Biden-era presidency. But it wouldn't have needed to happen at all if Trump hadn't pulled out in the first place. And now since then, Trump has been trying to get Iran to agree to essentially the same deal it had in 2015 when it comes to nuclear power. But things are different now than they were then. It's been a decade, and Iran has been really slow to come to the table here. On top of that, there's been some speculation that Israel launched these attacks under the guise of this report because Trump restarted talks with Iran, hoping to force the U.S. to either stop working on this deal or, at worst, join another conflict in the Middle East. And on top of it, there are a lot of people pointing out that a war with Iran would be probably good for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whose approval ratings are in the 30s, with about 70% of Israelis earlier this year calling on him to resign. He's also currently avoiding an international criminal court trial over the bombing of Gaza and an Israeli court trial where he's facing corruption charges. And being a wartime prime minister is a pretty good way to avoid those things. A war also wouldn't be bad for Trump, despite the number of people who I said don't want to go to war, and his promises during the campaign that there would be no new wars while he was president. The American public is generally pretty supportive of presidents who send Americans to war for a cause like an existential threat, at least at the beginning of those wars. And Trump really could use a boost right now. His approval rating is at 41%. That's the lowest it's been since he was elected. Approval on how he's been doing in every major issue is under 50%. His biggest ones, immigration and bringing down prices, are way underwater at 42% and 28% approval rating. Now, I am not saying that Trump would get involved in a potentially nuclear war because he needs a boost in the polls, but presidents have done similar things in the past. It's called wagging the dog, meaning letting a distraction take over. But that does get us to today and our timeline for all of this, because President Trump, via the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt, said today this.
In light of that news, I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks. That's a quote directly from the president for all of you today.
So that's our timeline. 2 weeks before the U.S. could enter into another war in the Middle East, this time with major nuclear consequences on the table, likely from the U.S. side of this conflict, given what we know about the lack of a nuclear arsenal that Iran seems to have. And it's a fight that experts largely agree didn't need to happen and may very well have been caused by the U.S. and is being led by two leaders who are increasingly erratic, unpredictable, and unliked by their own people. 2 weeks. That's the time. All right. That is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack. And as always, share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod. All one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.